Hi, my name is Mary Rope, and I'm the Black Studies professor here in the Ethnic Studies program at Stan State. And I'm happy to provide a very brief overview of the history of racism within the United States. So I want to start off first by saying that the United States is the longest running white supremacist society in the entire history of the world as we know it since the last 500 years, and specifically the longest running white supremacist society with anti-Blackness at its core and as its foundation. The reason why this is the case, which I will say that based on my years and years of research, as well as my current research, I know it's hard to see this book as an absolute must read. It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. It's already being critically acclaimed as a must read for every single person who lives in the United States. So to give a brief overview of actually why we're in this current moment in this country, where as Isabel Wilkerson poses the question, will those who are still very much in support of anti-Blackness and white supremacy in the United States, will they choose white supremacy over democracy? And what we're seeing is that there's a core group, a constituency within the United States that has been choosing white supremacy over democracy. So this all started, roughly speaking, um, about a little bit more than 500 years ago in 1492, when European colonization of the Western Hemisphere began. Because without colonization, without the genocide of 90% of the indigenous peoples living in what is now called the United States or Turtle Island, as well as north to Canada and south to Mexico and Central and South America, without the conquest of the land, without the genocide of indigenous peoples, Europeans would not have been able to establish slavery, which about 140 years later in 1619, in the US in particular, I'm talking about the United States, you have the first kidnapped Africans from the country of Angola, who were actually kidnapped by a British pirate ship from a Portuguese ship that was carrying enslaved peoples. And these enslaved peoples, about, according to historical records, ranging in number from 30 to 60, were then by the British pirate ship sent to Point Comfort on the coast of the colony of Virginia, which later, of course, became one of the original 13 states, and then sold into slavery in Jamestown, the colony of Jamestown, as 1619. And in terms of the vast wealth of capitalism, not only in the United States, but also around the world, was built on the backs of stolen peoples on stolen land. So slave labor for nearly 250 years. If we count that by generations, it's 12 generations. And in fact, the United States has not even been an actual sovereign nation long enough for the United States to have existed in a time period in which slavery was not practiced, when we put it in the historic context, versus the nearly quarter of a millennium of when it was practiced. So to put it in terms that I think are more understandable, it will not be until the year 2111 that the US has been a country that has not practiced slavery for as long as it practiced slavery. And it is absolutely essential to understand the amount of incalculable wealth that was generated by the enslaved labor of people of African descent. And in fact, due to colonization and due to slavery worldwide, and a particular form of slavery that was distinct from any other slavery that had existed before, and tied it specifically to skin color, categorized the enslaved peoples of African descent and their descendants forever and ever and ever as chattel or as property. And you'd never had a system of slavery such as this. And even though slavery exists to this day in the form of human trafficking, it's not the same system. Having said that, in order to justify this practice, which was indescribably brutal, I'm like not going to get into the details about all of the different forms of violence, of very systematic violence that were used against enslaved peoples of African descent, not only in the US, but 90% of kidnapped Africans were sent to the Caribbean and to Latin America. So the US actually did not even enslave the majority of kidnapped Africans. In fact, it was Brazil in South America that did and practiced legalized slavery until 1888. And to this day has the largest number of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa. What's important to understand is all of the stereotypes that were used and that were created to justify not only keeping enslaved peoples, but their descendants that continue to this current day, that people of African descent are not fully human, that people of African descent are automatically animalistic, are automatically violent, criminals. Therefore, we have the race that we have with mass selective incarceration that we know disproportionately targets and incarcerates young Black men and increasingly Black women, followed by Latinx men and the Native American indigenous men. So that's just one example of how racism persists to this day. The other important thing to note that is both historic and current is that all other groups of peoples, including immigrants from, African descended immigrants from the continent of Africa, anytime immigrants came to this country, they always, they learned over time that the top of the rung of the racialized caste, it's a caste system because it's tied to skin color. And we can't, for those of us, we can't change that. There's no escaping the anti-Blackness and the systematic discrimination that happens even when researchers write control for socioeconomic status. It still disproportionately affects people of African descent. And so it's important to note that there was a racialized caste system that's inescapable in some critical ways, where those classified as white were placed at the top rung, those classified as Black, or especially the descendants of American chattel slavery, are placed at the bottom rung, and other groups, right, non-Black people of color have been able to come into this system and have been able to elevate themselves above that bottom rung. This is not to create divide and conquer. This is to acknowledge the way the racialized hierarchy is set up and why we still see the outcomes that we see to this day. We can look at the campus of not only of Stan State, where there's only maybe 2.3% Black students here, and then look at this as a whole system, whereas Melina Abdullah, I was putting it at 4%. Melina Abdullah, who is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter and a professor out of CSU LA, puts the number of the percentage of Black students in this whole system at 3.4%. That's not happening by accident. That's happening because of systemic barriers. That's happening because of anti-Blackness. So as much as this is, I wanted to give you a conversation about the historic foundations of racism in the United States, and in particular of anti-Blackness. Again, the United States is the most intensive, the most egregious, and the most virulent anti-Black white supremacist country that has ever existed, period. So I hope to be able to join you on Thursday's discussion, and I hope that this gives you food for thought. Thank you.